So now I'm going to read you the next installment of Louis Sakar's Sideways Stories from the Wayside School. Here we go. Calvin. Calvin had a big round face. Calvin had a big round face. Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, I want you to take this note to Mrs. Zarvis for me. Mrs. Zarvis? asked Calvin. Yes, Miss Zarvis, said Miss Jules. You know where she is, don't you? Yes, said Calvin. She's on the 19th story. That's right, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Take it to her. Calvin didn't move. Well, what are you waiting for? Asked Mrs. Jules. She's on the 19th story, said Calvin. Yes, we have already established that fact, said Mrs. Jules. The 19th story? Calvin repeated. Yes, Calvin, the 19th story. Now take it up to her before I lose my patience. But Mrs. Jules, now, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, unless you would rather go home on the kindergarten bus. Yes, ma'am, said Calvin, and slowly he walked out her door. Ha ha ha, laughed Terence. Take it to the 19th story. Give it to Miss Zarvis, hooted Myron. Have fun on the 19th story, called Jason. Calvin stood outside the door to the classroom and didn't know where to go. As you know, when the builder built Wayside School, he accidentally built it sideways. But he also forgot to build the 19th floor. He built the 18th and he built the 20th, but no 19th. He said he was very sorry. There was also no Mrs. Zarvis. Miss Zarvis taught the class on the 19th story. Since there's no 19th story, there's no Miss Zarvis. And besides that, as if Calvin didn't have enough problems, there was no note. Mrs. Jules had never given Calvin the note. Boy, this is just great, said Calvin. Just great. I'm supposed to take a note that I don't have to a teacher who doesn't exist and who teaches on a story that was never built. He didn't know what to do. He walked down to the 18th story, then back up to the 20th, back down to the 18th, back up to the 20th. There was no 19th story. There never was a 19th story, and there never will be a 19th story. Calvin walked down to the administration office. He decided to put the note on Miss Zarvis's mailbox, but there wasn't one of those either. That didn't bother Calvin too much. However, since he didn't have a note, he looked out the window and saw Louis, the yard teacher, shooting baskets. Louis, well, you know what to do, probably, he thought. Calvin went outside. Hey, Louis. Hi, Calvin, said Louis. He tossed him the basketball. Calvin dribbled it up and took a shot. He missed, and Louis tipped it in. Do you want to play a game? Louis asked. I don't have time, said Calvin. I have to deliver a note to Miss Zarvis up on the 19th story. Then what are you doing all the way down here? Said Louis. There is no 19th story, said Calvin. Then where is Miss Zarvis? Asked Louis. There is no Miss Zarvis, said Calvin. And what are you going to do with the note? Asked Louis. And there is no note, said Calvin. Oh, I understand. That's good, because I sure don't, said Calvin. It's very simple, said Louis. You are not supposed to take the notes to no teachers. You already haven't done it. Calvin still didn't understand. I'll just have to tell Miss Jules that I couldn't deliver the note, he said. That's good, said Louis. The truth is always better. Besides, I don't think I understand what I said either. Calvin walked back up the 30 flights of stairs to Mrs. Jules' class. Thank you very much, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Calvin said, but Mrs. Jules interrupted him. That was a very important note, and I'm glad I was able to count on you. Yes, but you see, said Calvin, you delivered the note to Miss Zarvis on the 19th story, asked Jason. How did you do it? What do you mean, how did he do it? Asked Mrs. Jules. He gave Mrs. Jarvis the note. Some people, Jason, are responsible. But you see, Mrs. Jules, said Calvin. The note was very important, said Mrs. Jules. I told Miss Jarvis not to meet me for lunch. Don't worry, said Calvin. She won't. Good, said Mrs. Jules. I have a coffee can full of Tootsie Roll Pops on my desk. You may help yourself to one for being such a good messenger. Thanks, said Calvin. But really, it was nothing.